to Albumistic, the podcast where a guy who knows a little bit about music gives his unsolicited opinion about different albums on the internet. Today we're going to be checking out Simon & Garfunkel's album Bookends from 1968. This is an album that, honestly, I consider to probably be the most beautiful musical project that I have heard. At least that isn't like classical music, that is widely regarded as beautiful. But when I think of an album, like a rock album or something that I think is particularly beautiful, this is the one I think of. And that's why I think I thought it would be a good start for this podcast. So a little bit of background. If you don't know Simon and Garfunkel, I don't know how you wouldn't know them. If you haven't at least heard the name, you've probably been living under a rock. Simon and Garfunkel were a folk rock duo during the 60s mostly. They started in the 50s when they were very, very young. In fact, their name then was Tom and Jerry. That was the name that their record had given to them as a duo. And they had a song called Hey Schoolgirl, and that was kind of what they were known for. They eventually changed their duo name to Simon and Garfunkel. That's for Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel. Those were their names. And they released their first album, Wednesday Morning 3 a.m., under this name. This album didn't get a whole lot of recognition, so it was kind of a bit of a rocky start, but after a few more albums, they started picking up more of an audience, most notably their album, The Sounds of Silence, and then right after that one, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme. Those were kind of their breakout. And then Bookends, which is their fourth studio album, came right after Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme. And this was kind of the one that made them the biggest, other than their final album after this one. So Paul Simon is the more recognizable name due to his solo career after Simon and Garfunkel broke up. He was kind of the lead man. He wrote all the songs. He put them together. Art Garfunkel would also provide vocals and I believe background instruments too. And while Paul Simon was kind of like the forefront of the process, he always made sure that Art Garfunkel was, kind of appreciated for his work too. But of course, the kind of famous story with their fifth and final album as a duo, Bridge Over Troubled Water, it's kind of famous for them breaking up. Because there was just some conflicts they couldn't get through with Paul Simon kind of writing all the music and Garfunkel just kind of doing his own thing, acting and not really being around much. So that's kind of like their famous breakup. That's kind of the background behind this duo. So back to Bookends. Bookends, like I said, their fourth studio album. It was released on April 3rd, 1968. And this is what they call a concept album, which is basically an album that kind of has a concept or a story that it follows throughout it. And a lot of concept albums can kind of be different in how they approach that. With this one specifically, it's kind of like the first half of the album kind of has this narrative about life and aging and using a kind of metaphor of bookends as a life and the kind of contents that are in between. You start at the beginning and it kind of focuses on the younger, youth side of life. And then as it goes through, it goes to being old and kind of dealing with death and looking back on your life. And then the second half of the album is kind of just like singles. I kind of wish they had done like a disc 1 and disc 2 kind of situation to separate them more, because it does seem like the first half of the album is kind of more like a concrete project, and then the second half is just kind of stuff they added on. It even could have worked as like an EP or something, like a shorter project instead of a full-length album. But I think it's still fine. It's just kind of, when I think of Bookends as like the most beautiful album I've heard, I think of the first half mostly, and then the second half is like, oh yeah, they're just really good songs. But anyway, I'm just going to kind of go through track by track. So track 1 is the Bookends theme. It's a very beautiful, just kind of guitar song. There's not a whole lot to go over this. It's a very short intro, but it kind of sets up the kind of narrative that's going to be played out. And it kind of plays as the first bookend, the left bookend, if that makes sense, in this kind of metaphor, because we have the Bookends theme at the beginning, and then Track 7 is the Bookends theme reprise, and that kind of ends off the kind of narrative that they're telling. So it's kind of like those songs are the bookends with the contents in between. So I've always enjoyed that kind of aspect of the opening track and track 7, but we'll talk about that a bit later. So the Bookends theme seamlessly transitions into track 2, Save the Life of My Child. And I love when albums do this because just going straight from track 1 into track 2 makes it feel so cohesive already, and it kind of sets this tone for the rest of the album whenever any artist does this. So I always appreciate that. It kind of makes the rest of the project feel like put together, even if they don't seamlessly transition into each other. But Save the Life of My Child, Simon and Garfunkel had been kind of doing folk rock for a while in their past albums, and there wasn't a whole lot of like electric elements or synths or even electric guitars. They had some, like Sounds of Silence opening track was The Sound of Silence, but an electric version, meaning they had like electric guitars and stuff. But Save the Life of My Child is kind of a weird one for them, where they just kind of open with this big booming synth that they hadn't really done before, and then there's kind of just like this distant guitar. There's always a guitar that's kind of present, but this is a really good track. It kind of follows the narrative of a young kid. We don't really know how young, probably teenage age. He's standing on the edge of a bridge, and the whole town is kind of freaking out, thinking that he's going to jump. And it's kind of just this narrative of like, there's a kid who is about to kill himself, and none of the town knows how to deal with it, and is kind of shifting the blame to other things. We can see the police officer is like, yeah, the kids just don't have any respect for the law, so we can't save him. And it's ultimately just kind of this tragedy. The mother cries out, "Save the life of my child," but at the end it says the kid, he flew away. And it kind of just makes this image of he's jumping off the bridge. But it's kind of like this cool song with all these different elements. It's one of those songs where the lyrical content is kind of depressing, but then the actual instrumentation is kind of upbeat, and it keeps you on your toes. I really like it. And then it kind of also transitions into track 3, America, which kind of tells the tale of a young couple. See, we're moving on from like teenage age to like a younger adult. And they're traveling from somewhere to America. And it kind of just tells this story of this young couple. We don't know the name of whoever the narrator is, but he's with who he calls Kathy. And so it's kind of just this sweet song. Nothing really rhymes either. It kind of tells the story, but you don't really notice it as you're listening. It's just you're just kind of entrapped by the story and all the little details of how they interact with each other. And kind of what America is supposed to be as like a free place for people to come to. So there's nothing too crazy about this song, but just the fact that it doesn't rhyme, it's kind of just like telling a story with an inconsistent kind of melody for the verses. It's a really interesting song, and yeah, it's one of the highlights for me, really. And then going into track 4 is Overs, which is a kind of more somber song about knowing a relationship is over. And it kind of takes the place of like an maybe kind of middle-aged married couple who's kind of on the brink of divorce. It's heartbreaking. He starts out by saying, "Why don't we stop fooling ourselves? The game is over." So it's like they both know this relationship is done, but it's just still kind of tragic because he ends it off by saying, "Each time I try on the thought of leaving you, I stop and think it over." So he doesn't want to let go because he's given so much of himself to this relationship. But like he said, the game is over. They both know it. And kind of in like this bridge section of the song, we have Garfunkel giving this beautiful kind of like falsetto delivery of kind of a theme in this album of time and how it's unrelenting. It won't let you go free. He says, "Time is tapping on my forehead, looking in my mirror, rattling the teacups." And it's just kind of this really cool imagery of time and how you can see aging everywhere, especially at this point of your life, in a kind of, I guess, dying marriage, if that makes sense. Then we go into track 5, Voices of Old People. Now, this one's not a song. It's a recording, a kind of dynamic recording, really, of voices of old people, just kind of talking about their lives when they were young, now that they're old. And it's just kind of, it's a really weird thing to put in the album, but it kind of puts you in this place of thinking about being old, and what old people have been through in their life. And it kind of sets up for track 6, Old Friends, which is the absolute pinnacle of this album, in my opinion. Old Friends, it tells the story of two old friends who have known each other for a very long time, sitting on a park bench, kind of just thinking about their lives together. And it really fascinates me because Paul Simon wrote this when he was like in his 20s. And he just has such a mature and introspective knowledge of like what it would be like to be sitting with an old friend that you have known basically your whole life. And it's just such a beautiful song. It kind of starts with this like somber start on the guitar and some strings, and then it goes into this beautiful kind of classical string section in the middle where it gets really intense, and then very, very seamlessly transitions into track 7, the Bookends theme reprise, which again goes back to the original Bookends theme on track 1 with that guitar. But then it adds lyrics, kind of closing out this half of the album. He says, "Time it was, and what a time it was." And so it's kind of like ending out a bookend of life. And it kind of finishes off that narrative very nicely. And so that's kind of why I feel like it's like so beautiful, because it's such a simple yet profound way to kind of describe life, how it's like two bookends with all the stories and adventures in between. So that's kind of the first half of the album, and then it just kind of drops you straight into Fakin' It, track 8, which is a very upbeat, very kind of tongue-in-cheek sort of song, about kind of feeling like you're just faking it till you make it, really. It's a very fun song, reminds me of high school a lot, specifically English class. That was kind of what would go through my head during it. Yeah, it's a really fun one. Track 9 is Punky's Dilemma, which is kind of like, it's kind of a well-hidden song about not wanting to go to war when you're drafted, kind of just wishing your life was more simple. He says, "I wish I was a Kellogg's cornflake." Like, literally, I just wish I was something that didn't have all this responsibility, that just had such a simple life. And it's just kind of a fun song with kind of a sad background to it of just like not really wanting to do this thing that life is throwing at you, but you have to do it, and just kind of wishing that life was a lot simpler. Then after that, we have track 10, Mrs. Robinson, very famous song. It's very surprising if you don't know it. Simon and Garfunkel had been hired to make the soundtrack for a film called The Graduate, that was released in 1967, so a year before this album came out. And so they made the soundtrack for that movie, and one of the songs that they wrote for it was this song called Mrs. Robinson, which was a character in the movie. So they wrote that song. It was a lot different in the movie, but they redid it for this album here. And I think that's the one that most people are familiar with. But yeah, it's a very, very simple song, just kind of chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse. But it's very famous, very catchy. Yeah. Track 11 is A Hazy Shade of Winter. Now, the Bangles actually did a cover of this song later on, but Simon and Garfunkel wrote this originally. I think the Bangles version might be more popular than this one, but Simon and Garfunkel did write it. This is the original. It's kind of different from the rest of the album. It's kind of got like a heavier kind of acoustic rock sound, but it's very, very catchy, very upbeat. It's kind of got this epic kind of cinematic feel to it, but as much as you would do as like a folk rock album. So that's a good track to listen to. And then closing it out with track 12, At the Zoo, which is the only song I could think of anytime I visit the zoo. But basically, it's just kind of a fun track. It kind of goes into this kind of narrative about different characteristics of these animals at the zoo, and even the zookeeper, and how he's very fond of rum. Zebras are reactionaries. Antelopes are visionaries. It's just these really fun rhymes that just kind of makes this fun narrative for these animals at the zoo and just kind of makes it this silly kind of story. And then it just kind of fades out and closes the album. So yeah, that's Bookends in a nutshell. 1968. It still holds up really well. I think it kind of had a lot of influence on rock in general. Just this duo. People always think about the Beatles and a bunch of other bands from around this time that really influenced rock. But I don't think Simon and Garfunkel gets mentioned enough because I listen to this and it's like, wow, they were way ahead of their time just with how they produced their songs, just kind of the beautiful poetry in the lyrics. And it's really no wonder to me that when Paul Simon went on to his solo career, like he still found all these successes in different albums just because what he writes is timeless and it's real and it's true. And he doesn't stick to just one sound. You can kind of see that throughout not only Simon and Garfunkel's discography, but his own discography. Just all the kind of playing with different sounds and different genres. It kind of feels like in his solo career, every album that he's made is like a different genre and a different sound. You got Still Crazy After All These Years is kind of like a softer kind of jazz, even some kind of gospel music. And then you've got Graceland, which is kind of a weird mix of like this African tribe music with kind of a poppy, maybe kind of soft rock sound. So I think that's ultimately what makes Simon and Garfunkel and Paul Simon so popular and so timeless, is just the ability to kind of just do whatever they want with their music, and to make it creative and to produce it differently in a way that still sounds good and still sounds beautiful. And that's what I love about this album. Everything is so different about it, but it's so beautifully put together, and the narrative, and then also just like the kind of fun singles in the second half. So yeah, that is Simon and Garfunkel's Bookends. Thank you so much for listening. I had a blast making this and listening to this music. I hope you have a great day and go and listen to some more music. See you later.